Okay, besties, let's spill some serious tea today because democracy was not just handed out like free samples at the grocery store. Oh no, people had to fight tooth and nail to make sure everyone got a say at the ballot box. And let me give a quick shout out to John Lewis, the ultimate good trouble king, because he and so many others put everything on the line so that voting rights weren't just a suggestion, but a real thing. Okay, before we get to the marches, the speeches, and the moment the world finally had to pay attention, we need to talk about what made it necessary. Because for years, in some places, the right to vote was a mirage. It looked real on paper, but every time someone reached for it, it disappeared. After the Civil War, when the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, it said that voting couldn't be denied based on race. Black men in the South showed up to the polls, and for a brief moment, democracy actually worked the way it was supposed to. But that didn't sit well with some politicians who had built their power on making sure only certain voices were heard. So instead of outright banning black voters, they got creative. Picture this. You walk up to register to vote, and the official at the desk hands you a test. Not just any test, but something so confusing that even a college professor would struggle. Maybe it's a complicated passage to read, or a random question about the state constitution, or something so absurd like how many jelly beans are in this jar, but there's just no way to win. If you get through that, there's a fee to pay. And if you're lucky enough to scrape the money together, you find out that there's a rule that only people whose grandfathers could vote are eligible. And if your grandfather was denied that right, well, you see the problem. And if you still somehow managed to get on the voter roll, then came the intimidation. Polling places conveniently ran out of ballots. Names mysteriously disappeared from registration lists. And sometimes, just showing up meant risking your job, your home, or even your safety. So by the 1950s and 60s, people had had enough. Across the South, activists, many of them students, started demanding change. And they weren't just marching or holding signs, they were testing the system to show the world what was really happening. And that's where the Freedom Riders come in. In 1961, these young people, black and white together, got on buses and rode into cities where public transportation was supposed to be desegregated. But in reality, it wasn't. They sat where they weren't supposed to sit. They walked into stations and used the wrong waiting rooms, and at every stop, they were met with hostility. In Anniston, Alabama, one of their buses was surrounded and set on fire. In Birmingham, they were beaten while police conveniently took a break. But here's what made the Freedom Riders unstoppable. Every time one group was arrested or attacked, another group stepped up. By the time it was over 400 people had joined the rides. They got beaten, jailed, nearly killed. But they won. By November 1961, the federal government finally stepped in and desegregated buses for real. After the Supreme Court made their ruling, buses were finally desegregated. But voting? Still a disaster. In Selma, Alabama, only 2% of black adults were registered to vote. Not because they weren't trying, but because racist officials blocked them at every turn. Trying to register? Boom, arrested. Your application is perfect? Oops, we lost your paperwork. You actually made it to vote? Boom, a mob is waiting for you outside. So the civil rights movement said, it's go time. On March 7, 1965, about 600 peaceful marchers started walking from Selma to Montgomery. But when they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they saw police waiting with tear gas, clubs, and whips. They didn't even hesitate. They kept walking. And then the officers charged. It was chaos. Tear gas filled the air, batons rained down, and people ran for their lives. John Lewis had his skull fractured. Others were trampled. But here's the thing. The cameras were rolling. The nation saw what was happening, and for many, it was the first time they realized just how bad things were. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been slow to act, couldn't ignore it anymore. That same month, he introduced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that's how we got the Voting Rights Act of 1965, aka the law that finally put an end to Jim Crow's petty games. It banned literacy tests. It sent federal officials to monitor elections in places with a history of voter suppression. And for the first time in U.S. history, voting discrimination actually had legal consequences. And guess what? It worked. By 1968, black voter registration in the South jumped from 29% to 64%. Oh, and let's not forget the 24th Amendment from 1964, which banned poll taxes, because really, charging people to vote was next level ridiculous. You'd think that was a happily ever after moment, right? The truth is, democracy only works if people participate, and history has shown that voting rights require constant attention. Over the years, discussions around voting access have continued. People have debated how to ensure fair elections, how to balance security with accessibility, and how to make sure every eligible voter has the opportunity to cast their ballot. One thing is clear. This right was hard-earned, and people sacrificed everything to secure it. When we vote, we honor that legacy and make sure every voice is heard. And that's the T on the quest for voting rights. Please join us next time as we compare Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to civil rights with Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. It's a conversation you won't want to miss.